From courtside of the virtual hardwood, it's the NLSC Podcast, a weekly show for basketball gamers and hardcore hoopheads. And with you once again, I am joined as always by my co-host Derek, aka D4 3. Derek, everyone is entitled to their opinions on basketball, but those opinions needn't go unchallenged. To that end, we're giving our opinions on some recent basketball opinions, so please, tip us off.
Yeah, the disrespect for past players, athletes, teams, etc. It continues, Andrew. And this time the messenger is Stan Van Gundy, former coach and currently a analyst for Amazon Prime's NBA coverage. He stated on the Zach Lowe podcast that the evolution of athletes is, well, we can probably say that the best 20 basketball players in history have probably played in the last 20 years. Those other guys are great, but if you took them for what they were in their time and dropped them into today's game, a lot of those guys couldn't even get in the league. And I'm talking about some guys who are in the top 75 all time. And I don't say that to disparage people. We evolve over time. Athletes are getting better. How can you look at a sport like track and field or swimming and see that the times keep improving and think in our sport, players don't continue to get better and better? In the same interview, Andrew, he also states that he believes that Jokic is probably the greatest player of all time and that Luka Doncic is the best offensive player of all time. There's so much wrong with this. And sometimes I think that when comments are made like this that are so outlandish, that the person is just trying to keep their contract, right?
Yeah, rage bait. Get a reaction. Yeah.
To say this, that maybe they're selling a book. Maybe they were told you have to say something in order to get a reaction. And the reason for this is this has happened in the past, right? You remember when Kevin Garnett was coming out with a book, he made a comment that stated that something along the lines that the players were, so saucy today or something like that, that he doesn't know if players from his era would be able to play in today's NBA. And then he completely contradicts himself like a month or two later after the book was released and all of that, and makes comments on the contrary that talk about how great the players were in the past, talks about all-time players, talks about all the issues with today's game, etc. So we've seen it in the past. I know that Stan Van Gundy recently signed up with Amazon Prime to do their NBA coverage after TNT lost their rights. And so he became an analyst for Amazon Prime in 25, 26. Again, I can't prove that this isn't just Stan Van Gundy's real train of thought, but sometimes I think that these guys are selling out when they say stuff like this. He had also made a comment in 2024 that stated, that's probably the best NBA roster I've seen, talking about the 2024 Boston Celtics. He stated all 5 of their starters are plus defenders. So stating that championship team for the Boston Celtics is the best roster he's ever seen. So the best roster of all time.
Big call.
So that's a big one. Right. So if he really does think these things, he is entitled to his opinion. But when he says that the best 20 basketball players in history have probably played in the last 20 years, that's excluding Michael Jordan, Hakeem Olajuwon, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, Bill Russell, Wilt Chamberlain. I can go on and on and on. And what? That doesn't even make sense. And another important point is that if you asked Stan Van Gundy to name his top 10 players of all time, or its top 20, it would be flooded with players from further back than 20 years ago. He would absolutely have Michael Jordan in there. He would have Magic Johnson in there, Larry Bird, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Wilt Chamberlain, etc. There is no way that he wouldn't. And that's another very important point, because these guys who make statements like this constantly contradict themselves, constantly change things up. And Andrew, I also want to point something out. Some of the players that he would probably include as of the last 20 years started in the 90s, right? Dirk Nowitzki, Kevin Garnett, Tim Duncan, Kobe Bryant, et cetera, et cetera. There's many players that started their careers in the 90s that he would be including for those selections. So give me a break.
Yeah, it's something we've mentioned before, the overlap between eras. People don't acknowledge that.
Yeah, you have guys that excelled and were excellent in like the early 80s or early mid 80s, and then they were also excellent in the mid late 90s and whatnot. How is that possible, right? Even some that had very long careers that were successful in the early 2000s, guys like John Stockton and Karl Malone and whatnot. How would that be possible, right? And so that's why I hate that whole thing where it's like, well, the NBA, peaked at this time, or it started being great at this time. There were already great players. It's the NBA. It's professional basketball. It's supposed to be the best players in the world. It's been great for decades.
Young Kareem taking it to Wilt, older Kareem hanging with young Hakeem.
Exactly. And his comment also about track and field and swimming and whatnot, there's also, and I posted this on social media, there's data that shows that in those sports, depending on the event, and in other sports not related to basketball, that records still stand from 50, 60 plus years ago. So why would those records still stand? It's called him just using a blanket statement and people running with it. And oftentimes people who get these platforms, Andrew, that works, right? Because what is it all about? It's about the hot take, Andrew, right? It's all about, he makes this quick statement and then it gets plastered all over social media. It's all over YouTube. It's all over Twitter. It's, everybody's talking about it, and nobody looks to fact check. Nobody looks to, potentially see the other side of the case. It's just like Stan Van Gundy said this, and now let's all talk about it.
Yeah, you do wonder if it is his real opinions, or if he's just, as you said, rage baiting. He's got that deal with Amazon Prime. This is the commentary that he's throwing out there to get engagement bait, rage bait. Absolutely a thing these days. I've been a bit more active on Threads recently, and as people are trying to build their following there, I'm seeing a lot of hot takes. And of course, hot take culture has been a thing for a while now, but you can see people throwing stuff out there just to get the algorithm, just to trend, just to get people talking and interacting with them. Doesn't matter if it's good or bad. And it does pollute the discourse. And we've talked about this before, that it does dumb down the discourse and disrespect the past. I saw a tweet the other day, speaking of social media, from one Andy Roth. Says, the NBA community demeans, downplays, and ignores its history like no other sport. That's just a basketball truth. And we can absolutely speak to that, being on social media as we are, Derek, and seeing those kinds of hot takes. And it sucks when someone like Stan Van Gundy does it, because it adds some kind of legitimacy, him being a former NBA coach, him being involved with the league for many years. Look, if it's just some random person, some fan account, some muse account on social media throwing out these takes about plumbers and dentists and all that other nonsense, you can ignore that. But this is somebody who actually has history in the league, some measure of success in the league. Of course, Shaq did once call him a front runner and criticize his coaching, but he does still have a record in the NBA. He still did coach in the NBA. He has some kind of credibility. So it does make you wonder if he is genuine in his thoughts, whether he truly believes that. I do think these days there is money to be made and relevancy to be had by being the older personality who eschews the whole, bitter old head stereotype. He's the quote-unquote good older person who is willing to dump on the past to prop up the present. He could be leaning into that grift, quite frankly. It's certainly possible. But whatever his motivations, that statement about the 20 best players playing in the last 20 years is absolutely ridiculous, absolutely disrespectful, absolutely wrong. You mentioned just a few of the players who would absolutely dominate in any era, be successful in any era, And the fact that we're downplaying the past like that, the fact that we're trying to profit the present by saying that the present players are beating a bunch of players who weren't really athletes. Like you said, there are plenty of great athletes back in the day, records in all kinds of athletic events that have stood for years. The whole evolution argument being made by people who couldn't even pass high school science, and here they are talking about human evolution, is just ridiculous. I hate how disrespectful it is. There's no need to downplay the past to profit the present like that. And the idea that none of those players could compete today and that the top 20 players of all time doesn't include anyone from before 2005, absolutely absurd.
I want to point out that just being involved in the league in the past, whether it being a coach or a player or anything, has not proven that arguments by these people are made in good faith.
Oh, sure.
It doesn't mean that they're always the most knowledgeable either. Look at guys like Gilbert Arenas, right?
Yeah.
Look at the unbelievably outlandish crap that he's stated, proven wrong, things that are not accurate, saying things like Anthony Mason and Russell Westbrook are the same size, saying that Scottie Pippen and Dennis Rodman would be considered small guards in today's NBA. Meanwhile, by the way, Golden State Warriors often start Draymond Green at center, and he's 6'6".
Yeah.
You can look at so many things that former players like Gilbert Arenas, Al Harrington, Lou Williams, I could go on and on, have said that are not accurate, that are oftentimes hot takes, that often just defy logic. So that's number one. Number two, they're right. When it comes to the sport that craps on the past the most, it's basketball. And, you listen to NFL games and you listen to commentary on football. And sometimes I see these posts on social media. You never hear anybody stating that Barry Sanders couldn't play today, right? You never hear anybody stating that Barry Sanders wouldn't be absolutely crushing it in today's game. You don't hear crap about Terrell Owens, Randy Moss, Jerry Rice, etc. Them stating that, these guys wouldn't be able to cut it in today's advanced NFL, right? You don't hear people stating that Dan Marino, Joe Montana, Steve Young, Troy Aikman, John Elway, all of these great quarterbacks from the past. You don't hear commentary related to these guys wouldn't be able to hang in today's game for various reasons. In fact, in the NFL, they're pretty open about things like the QB game, going downhill. Tom Brady has talked about it on air. Tony Romo talked about it at one point, about how, quarterbacks at one point, were superior to what we have in today's game. You also don't hear this stuff in baseball. I mean, sure, sometimes you'll get a comment where it states pitchers are pitching faster today and whatnot, disregarding the fact, obviously, that when the ball is thrown and it's mid-air, it used to be measured at the glove as opposed to now where it's measured at the base. So there's more velocity, so it registers a higher mile per hour, right? There was a case of Nolan Ryan being compared to Adonis Chapman, and that point was pointed out. But you don't hear that as much in baseball either. In fact, what you hear in baseball is that, why are the batting averages so low, right? Everybody's swinging for the fences. The game is not as smart as it used to be. There's not as much strategy as it used to be. A lot of people think that baseball is kind of being dumbed down. You used to have pitchers that pitched 7, 8, sometimes 9 innings and whatnot. Again, in a case like Nolan Ryan. And now they're oftentimes not letting pitchers go past 5 innings. And then somebody comes in and it's like, we're going to only let you throw 1 inning and you can't throw another one. So players don't appear to be as durable or be able to play as long anymore. So you don't hear that as much in baseball either. And of course, you don't hear about it really in hockey either. So basketball, for some reason, Andrew, it's a routine practice to crap on the past in order to prop up the present. And the talking points are never good, right? And I feel like the talking points are never done in good faith. And I'm going to throw it back to you, but players from the past had absolutely everything that they needed in order to succeed at the highest level from an athletic and skill standpoint. From an athleticism standpoint, they had gyms, right? They had weights. Oftentimes they did have trainers. They had, boxes for, box jumps and all of that stuff. They had rope. They had free weight machines, all of that stuff. They had a basketball court. Basketball court's the same size. The ball weighs the same. The hoops are the same height, all of that stuff. Like, all the players from the past had the tools to play basketball at the highest level. And I'm just so sick of this whole BS about evolution and everything, because when I watch the NBA now and I watch the way these players are playing, I can see a lot of holes in the game, and many holes that I didn't see watching basketball growing up and when I was a young adult. I see skill gaps, right? I see things that players should be doing today that they're not, that they were doing in the past. I see a lack of strength in today's game. I see more injuries in today's game. I see, a lack of competitiveness in today's game. I don't see that overall skill has peaked in today's game. I feel like it's actually declined from when I watched basketball growing up and as a young adult.
I mean, you and our listeners will not be surprised to hear that I completely agree with that assessment. I absolutely feel the same way about the modern game and also the way older players are looked at. And it's the same in other sports here in Australia too, like cricket. Alan Border, Don Bradman, the great Don Bradman, they're not talked down about just because they played decades ago. Andrew Johns, the great rugby league player in my hometown, not disrespected, saying, oh, he couldn't play today. It just really does seem to be basketball. And it's interesting that, just the way the league is marketed, and I don't care for it at all. And as far as the skill sets, the evolution, etc., I go back to the criticism that Charles Barkley had of Miles Turner in the playoffs last year, saying that he needed to get down on the block, stop shooting threes. And people are saying, oh, well, he's not a post-up player. He's not a Kim Olajuwon. He's not an old-school player. He takes threes. The game has evolved. And look, I understand roles changing, big men being able to shoot. That's not a bad thing in and of itself. But if you are 7 foot tall, or close to 7 foot tall, and you've got a mismatch in the post, and you can't do anything about it, you can't use your size, even against a player that's a similar size, if you can't get down there and score in the paint when you're 6'10", 7 foot tall, that is a problem. And they talk about big men being more skilled because they can hit threes. But if they don't have that post game, if they don't have that inside dominance as well, then it's not really more skilled. They've traded one skill set for another skill set. Now you look at someone like...
Well, evolution apparently is not knowing how to use your height. Yeah. Evolution is apparently, not knowing how to score on somebody shorter than you. Evolution is apparently not knowing how to have good footwork in the post and being able to do very basic big men things that happened back in the day, like half hooks, sometimes a full hook, being able to drop step, being able to turn over either shoulder, being able to execute a quick spin move, being able to use your strength, all of that stuff. And I also want to point something out before you continue. Bad practices over time are going to erode a sport. Bad practices over time are going to make it so the sport can decline. And that's where I think we're at. A lot, this AAU generation, the AAU stuff that's been going on, to Stan Van Gundy's point, mostly over the last 20, 25 years, right? That style of play, that mindset, the teachings at those levels, at the youth levels, has spawned what we're seeing in today's NBA. It's ridiculous to state, oh, well, the game has evolved and try to always chalk that up to a positive. It's evolved into something worse based on those bad practices, based on what, these gurus are doing, these personal trainers oftentimes, these coaches at the youth level, and then at the high school level, the college level, and then now obviously at the NBA level. But it starts at the youth level. But this has been going on for 20 to 25 years, and now this is what you get.
Oh, absolutely. And once again, if you have a big man who can only shoot threes, can't get the job done down low, doesn't have those moves in the post, can't dominate a shorter player if they find themselves with such a mismatch, then basically they've traded one skill set for another, one limitation for another. Now, if you want to point to someone like Wemby and say, that's evolution, here's somebody who can, especially after working with Hakeem, go to work in the post, is working on his post game, scoring inside even more efficiently, can also shoot, can put the ball on the floor, etc., then sure, that is different. That is a form of evolution, I suppose. But to a point we made on a previous show, Wemby is out of this world, one of those out of this world players. He is not the norm. You don't have a league full of big men dribbling like Allen Iverson, shooting like Steph Curry, driving like Michael Jordan, all that stuff. You don't have these players, to make a video game comparison, a bunch of 99 overall players, basically everybody like a my player, maxed out, my player, dominating the league, doing absolutely everything. There are still one-dimensional players. It's just that they've switched from one skill set to another. So I absolutely don't buy the evolution argument. And we brought it up before, Jokic obviously does handle the ball for the Nuggets, but as you pointed out, he gets trapped. He doesn't beat double teams off the dribble, bringing the ball up the court. He doesn't dribble like Steph Curry or Allen Iverson or Kyrie Irving or anyone else who is renowned for flashy ball handling and competent ball handling.
Well, that's the same.
John Stockton,
but that's the same for Wemby, though, Andrew. That's the same with Wemby.
Yeah.
Like, he doesn't get pressured. If he got pressured, he can't bring up the ball. He's
absolutely.
Not like a guard.
Absolutely.
And the other thing with Wemby too is, as far as the post stuff, he still has a ton of work to do from a strength perspective. Working in those areas, and he's not close to the strong post player, back to basket, a guy like Hakeem Olajuwon. I think he has a wide range of ways to score, and I think that's why he can be super effective on the offensive end. But I think that he can still do better.
As far as the skill level,
as a traditional. Yeah, but he might not get there, right? Because that's the game today, and he might never need to get there to become a legend. And Jokic too, the same thing. There was a comment that he made about athletes, right? And he tries to compare track and swimming, and he's talking about like times and stuff like that, which again is a blanket statement, which doesn't hold truth. He's trying to talk about elite athletes, and I talked about this in the Discord, and I've talked about this many times before. For the era, Andrew, that they state has the best athletes of all time, bigger, faster, stronger, all of that stuff. Most teams are playing small ball. And as it relates to athletes, the most dominant players in today's NBA, for the most part, are completely grounded. They're methodical players. They're not jumping really high. They're not running fast. Jokic, honestly, most of the time looks out of shape. To be completely honest, Doncic came into the season, last season, looking a little out of shape. He's lost some weight now, all of that stuff, but he's still a methodical player. Luka Doncic and Jokic, and then you got other players around the league that are below the rim, and oftentimes kind of methodical. The guys like Devin Booker, and when he was an MVP, Joel Embiid, very methodical, up and down the court, going at half speed most of the time, slower in countless ways in comparison to like Hakeem Olajuwon, and all of that stuff. Doesn't jump as high either, not the same athlete, etc. So this whole thing about athletes, when it doesn't make sense to me. Like I watch NBA games now, and I see the highlights and everything, and a lot of teams going small ball. I don't see the explosive dunks that I've seen from the past most of the time. I see a lot of players that don't know how to use their strength, or don't have the strength to use all of that, and then I don't see the varied skill sets. So the athletes thing bothers me.
True.
As well.
That's the big thing.
Because I go back and look at guys like Dominique Wilkins and Larry Nance and Michael Jordan and Clyde Drexler, and I could go on and on with just the amazing athletes from the past, James Worthy and everything, and Sean Kemp and all that. And these guys were freaks, the way they got up and down the court, the way they threw it down, their footwork, all of that stuff, and in the sheer size of a lot of these guys. And then you get to today's NBA, and I think those guys would be elite athletes in today's NBA as well. They'd be freaks in today's NBA as well. So I absolutely hate that argument. And, I was just looking at a couple of the lineups that were thrown out there last night in the NBA, and I'm like, you got to be kidding me. And I think the thing is, too, is that the focus on strength training, the focus on being, all around athletes, oftentimes multi-sport athletes, athletes that didn't work on the same movements all the time and only play basketball games, all of that stuff. Like, I think that was a bigger focus back in the day. You had players that were stronger. You had players that were better all around athletes and more durable. I think they were more explosive, etc. And I think that's why you see an uptick in injuries today. I think that's why you see a lot of low to the ground basketball. So I think there's a lot of factors in here. But at the end of the day, the athletes thing that he stated and that I've heard Gilbert Arenas talk about and all of that stuff, absolutely ridiculous. And I think it's completely wrong.
Yeah, and I should point out that when I'm talking about Wemby's skill set, I don't mean to say that he is elite at absolutely everything, but that is kind of an example, one example you could throw out there of somebody who does have that diverse skill set that people are claiming that everybody has these days. But that is not the case. And again, with somebody like a Miles Turner, it does seem like a case of trading one skill set for another. Gaining that outside shot, sure, but losing that inside game. Or the mid-range game, which again, players like Patrick Ewing, Hakeem Olajuwon, David Robinson, so many other big men back in the day had, and probably could have that three-point shot if that was the emphasis, if they didn't have such skill in the mid-range, and certainly in the paint, and even putting the ball on the floor as well. So yeah, it really does bother me, this idea that everybody is this multi-talented player who can do everything, at both ends of the floor, mind you. I think that back in the day, there were far more better two-way players in the league, especially on the wings. So again, this idea of evolution really does downplay the past. It's not rooted in any facts whatsoever, quite frankly, but it does prop up the now. It makes people who are watching basketball in 2025 and soon 2026 feel like this is the best ever. That's a big thing these days that you see on social media. Everything has to be the best. This current thing has to be the best. There's no way it could have taken a bad step. There's no way it can be in a lull, anything like that. Everything's best. Everything new is better. Not the case, and I don't just say that because of nostalgia. I say that because after 41 trips around the sun, Derek, I've seen busts. I've seen things not pan out. I've seen the next big thing turn out to be a total flop. New isn't always better. To your earlier point, things can devolve. They could change. It's not always positive evolution. But the current narrative has to be that what we're seeing is the best, make everybody feel like they're watching the best basketball that's ever been. It can't just be great. It can't just be something to enjoy in the moment. It has to have that historical connotations. And it's easy to portray today's game as being the best ever by downplaying the past. And I really hate to see people who should know better, like a Stan Van Gundy, championing the current NBA in that way, in that disrespectful way. And it's them trying to stay relevant, be the good old head, as I said, that is willing to be supposedly honest about the past not being as good and push that current narrative. There's money to be made there. There's relevancy to be had there. And I hate how disingenuous that is, much like gaming influencers who shill for companies, Derek. We've seen a lot of that in the basketball gaming community, pushing that narrative for NBA 2K. The same thing happens in real life. In fact, we've seen in the video games as well, Derek, and Stan Van Gundy is a voice in NBA 2K currently, that we're seeing those narratives pushed in the video games as well. So it's definitely a thing that people are buying into for money and relevance.
Yeah, a couple things. One, it's okay, in my opinion, to have a statement like this. Players today, I find them to be incredibly impressive. Sure. Right? Like, let's say Stan Van Gundy came out with a statement like this. Today's players, to me, are out of this world. They are incredibly impressive. I think that the players today could play in any generation of basketball and be successful.
Reasonable. Yeah.
He could say something like that and then not try to ignorantly drag down the past. And as he stated, not trying to disparage and kind of insult players from
that's like saying no
past
offense
eras,
and then
players
saying something
in teams.
completely offensive, It's like saying,
right,
I don't mean to be
exactly.
offensive, but here's a very offensive, rude statement to make. Yeah, everything before the but is kind of BS, yeah.
Right, exactly. I also want to point out that I think he brought it up, but I know that Gilbert Arenas has brought it up, and it was a big thing like over the last couple of years, talking about Bob Cousy and stating things like, well, Bob Cousy's in the top 75, but he couldn't even, make an NBA roster today. I find that to be hilarious because people never, ever talk about the rule changes. They never talk about how Bob Cousy had to come up where you couldn't even put your hand on the side of the ball. You basically had to slap the ball to dribble it. Your hand had to stay on top of it at all times, which makes it so evasive moves, things like crossovers, going behind the back and all of that stuff, things that he was still able to be successful at times, are 10 times harder. And this is coming from a basketball player, right? That is not easy to do. Meanwhile, today's players and players starting, probably, especially in like the early 90s and up, and then the Iverson influence and everything, they're allowed to have their hands on the side of the ball. In today's NBA, I saw Tyrese Maxey do a bunch of moves where his hand was under the ball, all of that stuff. Let's throw Tyrese Maxey back then and tell him he can't put his hand on the side of the ball. Do you have any idea how ridiculous Maxey would look trying to dribble back in Cousy's day? Put some of these players back in that era with those shoes on those courts, telling them that they have to play by those rules. It would be laughable. I would love to see JJ Redick, who made those comments about Bob Cousy. I would love to see him be thrown all the way back into Cousy's eras, make him play in the 50s, make him play in the early 60s and whatnot, and have to play by those rules. He would look ridiculous out there. So, that doesn't get talked about either. Stan Van Gundy says those players as they were, throw them into, today's game. And I don't think that they could play in today's NBA. Well, let's throw some of these players from today's NBA back in Cousy's era and make them slap the ball and wear those shoes and all of that stuff and see how effective they were.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
I don't think they would stand out. I think they would be very similar to what was happening back then. In fact, those players back then, like Cousy, had to master that art, had to master playing that way. Yeah, I think they would run circles around a lot of today's players. So I think that what he stated there was complete BS. It's a blanket statement, and it doesn't actually have any context that's relevant.
Before we go on, a reminder that the NLSC podcast comes out every week on the NLSC, nba-live.com, as well as our YouTube channel. We're also on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast apps. If you're listening on any of those apps, we'd greatly appreciate a review. To keep up with the show and everything we're doing with basketball gaming in general, connect with us on social media. On Twitter and Facebook, we are the NLSC. We also have an Instagram, NLSC Basketball, and on YouTube, we're youtube.com/NBA Live Series Center. Once again, visit us at nba-live.com, where in addition to the podcast, you'll also find all of our original content, as well as our forum and modding community. And what gets me about comments like this is that this is not how we were taught about NBA history growing up in the 80s and 90s and getting into basketball in the 90s, as I did. We had those tapes, Dazzling Dunks and Basketball Bloopers, those home videos that touch on NBA history and taught us about the great players of the past. And that was fascinating, and I loved that. And I love that we had that approach to NBA history in the coverage we had at the time. And that is something that has really changed in the 2010s. But we didn't have this attitude of, oh, those past players, they couldn't play today, or they don't deserve to be talked about as being some of the best of all time. You didn't have people saying, Bill Russell couldn't play today, Wilt Chamberlain couldn't play today. You might argue whether Wilt Chamberlain would have averaged 50 points in the 90s with the way the game was played, to your point. You probably wouldn't have the 100-point game because force-feeding to have that scoring in the 90s was very frowned upon. Attitudes did change in that regard. And of course, there are many great big men, 7-footers, in the 80s and 90s would have had a bit more competition. But to that point, it doesn't mean that Wilt wasn't a fantastic player. It doesn't mean that the 100-point game isn't worth talking about, isn't a special accomplishment. And yeah, we didn't have that attitude of old players shouldn't be talked about, shouldn't be considered among the best of all time. It really did change, I think, in the 2010s, pushing narratives like this, the social media generation. We weren't taught that kind of disrespect for the past back in the day.
Those conversations never were had. And, I played on the high school basketball team. I had basketball friends all growing up. After school, we continued to play pickup. We continued to play in leagues, all of that stuff. We used to talk about basketball. I never remember having those conversations. I never remember crapping on the past.
You lose
I never
credibility
remember saying things like Larry Bird wouldn't be as good today, or saying things like Bill Russell couldn't play today.
Yeah.
All of that stuff. Those things never happened. Like, my friends weren't talking about that. I wasn't either. We actually appreciated the past. And when a classic game would come on, how they had that, like the NBA's greatest games and all of that stuff, we would watch those.
Absolutely.
And we would never make comments like that. We would never make comments that, we're talking about, oh, well, this guy, he couldn't play today, or he wouldn't be as good today. It was kind of just appreciating what we were watching. I think at the height of social media is when this stuff started. I think hot take culture.
Yeah.
I think
ignorance is prized these days. A lot of people prize ignorance of the past, of facts. Like, again, if you said back in the day that Wilt couldn't play in the modern NBA, or he wasn't actually good, Bob Cousy, Bill Russell, Dr. J, Rick Barry, name any great player from the past, Jerry West, if you said they couldn't hang with modern players, or they weren't good, or they were plumbers and dentists, you'd be like, kid, you're ignorant. You have no credibility, no basketball knowledge. Now that ignorance is prized.
Do you know what Wilt Chamberlain would do to Draymond Green? Do you know what Wilt Chamberlain would do to Hartenstein? Do you know what Wilt Chamberlain would do to these centers in today's NBA, Joel Embiid, all of that stuff? Give me a break.
Hide the stools. Don't have a stool at courtside.
Yeah, I would give anything to be able to see that. The point is that I think, like I stated, it started like the height of social media, hot take culture, and unfortunately, what happens is the media, wants to get people talking. They want people focused on the sport. They want to get debate going and all of that stuff. And almost all of these debates and all of these talking points and all of these things that people get up in arms about as it relates to, is today's game better? Was the past NBA trash, etc. A lot, it stems from the media. It starts with the media. And, over the last 10 years or so, we've seen more and more, current players get involved, and former players, and former coaches, et cetera. And it's really, really, really disappointing to see the state of basketball discourse today. I also want to point out real quick, and then we can get to the community's responses related to this topic. He talks about Luka Doncic being the best offensive player of all time. There is nothing that I have seen Luka Doncic do that gets close to as impressive as stuff that I've seen Michael Jordan do, right? I think Luka Doncic is a product of today's game. I think that he is an incredibly impressive shot maker. I think that he can oftentimes be an incredibly impressive playmaker. He's going to go down as an all-time great. But to call him the greatest offensive player of all time, when I've seen players like Michael Jordan, when I've seen players like even, Akeem Olajuwon, I can't even believe how impressive he was. His highest points per game ever was 27.8, but I think he could have averaged more if he had wanted to. But he was double teamed absolutely constantly and had to be a playmaker out of that position, oftentimes because of the attention paid to him. Guys like Patrick Ewing, too, double teamed constantly. Every past game that I watch, they're throwing two defenders at Patrick Ewing at all times. But even, other players like saying that he's a better offensive player than a guy like Kobe Bryant, a peak Tracy McGrady. I can go on and on with certain players. I think that is some serious recency bias, and I think it's missing a whole lot of context. Also, with Jokic being the greatest of all time, what has happened with this? Like that, what a ridiculous hot take. And I'm not even talking about accolades. I'm talking about as a basketball player, I don't think that he's in that conversation. But when you talk about accomplishments as well, we have one NBA championship. He has multiple MVPs, as did Larry Bird, but we have one NBA championship. And Stan Van Gundy is calling him the greatest of all time. I think the greatest of all time for me has always been about that player's ability on the basketball court, accompanied by, what he was able to accomplish in his career. And I don't think Jokic is even close to anywhere near that conversation. Again, great player, incredibly skilled. I know you are a big fan of Jokic, but putting him in the greatest player of all time conversation, get out of here.
One of the things that bothers me about these arguments is that if you're going to make these declarations based on certain criteria, it has to be applied consistently across history. For example, LeBron James, 4 titles in 10 finals, that is nothing to sneeze at. That is certainly better than a lot of players have done. But Magic Johnson has 5 titles in 9 appearances. Pretty similar. 1 more title in 1 less appearance. And yet that criteria isn't used for Magic Johnson.
Right, but that doesn't, right, because it doesn't prop up today's game.
Absolutely.
Right? And it takes away from the whole, what the media wants is just Michael Jordan versus LeBron James GOAT debate. They want people to just focus on that because it's easy to have everybody get involved, and it puts one current player against one past player. But that doesn't get brought up with Magic Johnson. He makes that comment about Jokic, but what about Larry Bird's 3 straight MVPs and 3 NBA championships?
Absolutely.
In his short career and all of that. Ridiculous. And look at the numbers also that Larry put up and all that. So, we can't bring up Larry, though, right?
Oh, yeah. And funnily enough, we are recording this episode on Larry Bird's 69th birthday. So shout out to Larry Legend on his special day. But you talk about Jokic, if you're talking about having 1 or 2 titles, multiple MVPs, and incredible eye-popping stats, then you've got to bring Wilt Chamberlain into that discussion, because who has some of the most ridiculous stats in NBA history and winning MVP and Rookie of the Year in the same year? As a rookie, Wes Unseld also MVP and Rookie of the Year. A lot of players throughout history have these incredible statistics, these incredible accomplishments. Elvin Hayes, who played with Wes Unseld, of course, one of only 4 players in league history to have over 27,000 points and 16,000 rebounds. Barely missed a game in his career. Very much overlooked in the all-time great players conversation. But like you said, the narrative does distill it down to a couple of players, primarily MJ versus LeBron, and we don't celebrate history. And this is a perfect example, saying that the 20 best players in league history played in the last 20 years, and that most of the top 75 players of all time couldn't cut it today. Absolutely ridiculous.
What about Kareem's stats and Kareem's accomplishments?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Ridiculous. Yeah, and Wilt Chamberlain averaged 50 points per game and over 20 rebounds a game in his career and has more championships than Jokic. But from a skill perspective, I just want to point out, I think that, and I've talked about this many times before, I think Jokic benefits heavily on this freedom of movement era and the fact that this is the small ball era. And he's looked at as a massive man, a massive force in today's era. He is a great shot maker, but he's not being challenged consistently by people that can move him, that can pressure him, all of that stuff. Oftentimes when he's moving around the court, it looks like he's, just being able to just go wherever he wants and being able to get off any shot that he wants. I would love to be able to drop his current game into the 80s and 90s and see what happens. I'd love to see him getting chased around by David Robinson, right? I'd love to see him get chased around by Hakeem Olajuwon, by a younger Shaq. I'd love to see him being chased around by so many bigs of the past, like Alonzo Mourning and Dikembe Mutombo, and I'd love to see what they would do with him. I think that a lot of his stats, especially inflated rebounds and assists, come from the era that he plays in, and I don't think those would be even close in the 80s and 90s if he played in those eras, because of the way he moves and the way his game is in general. And I don't think he'd be scoring as many points either. So I think that's some context. I think that stuff matters. I think, I talked about it in the Discord. I think that this is the weakest era since I've been watching. So 90s, 2000s, etc. for big men. And I'm not just talking about big men as in centers. I'm talking about power forwards as well. And I think that these players, him, Giannis, etc., they benefit heavily from that, stats-wise.
Like a rim protection, absolutely.
Well. Yeah, those things matter, and those things should be mentioned in these conversations. Unfortunately, though, that's not a hot take that can be made because there's too much detail there, Andrew. There's way too much detail.
And one final point, I'm glad you brought up Kobe, because it does feel like, apart from some of the Mamba mentality stuff and some highlights being posted on social media, a lot of people are kind of pushing Kobe aside. And of course, people were championing Kobe as surpassing MJ for a while there during the early 2010s. That was getting some traction at that time. But they've really pushed Kobe aside in those debates and starting to downplay him. And I'm waiting for people to turn on the 2000s. We're almost at that point where we're done with the 90s crowd is going to be downplaying the 2000s. And that's going to be interesting because, of course, LeBron James being around for as long as he has, when people start talking about Kobe playing the weak era, and it's coming, Derek, you can see it coming. Once they start doing
it's starting to happen right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's starting to happen.
Once we really get going with that narrative, that's going to basically dismiss the first half of LeBron's career, and they're not going to be able to reconcile those narratives. So it's going to be very interesting.
My biggest problem is that it doesn't line up with anything that I'm watching. Like all these takes about today's game, it just doesn't line up with any of it. But let's get to the community's responses, Andrew. So I asked, what are your thoughts on Stan Van Gundy's statement? The best basketball players in history have probably played in the last 20 years. Do you disagree? Are you neutral, or do you agree? Roger Ward, Level 1 legend, states somewhat agree. The early 2000s, mid-2010s had tons of superstars, although many were derailed by injuries, Grant Hill, Brandon Roy, T-Mac, etc. But you can't deny the top-end talent of the 80s, Dream, Bird, Magic, and 90s against tougher defenses and tighter rules. So he somewhat agrees, but is also giving, props to many of the players and teams from the past and those eras as it relates to toughness, especially to, tougher defenses, and then also playing, with tighter rules. I don't think that the number of superstars was necessarily more in the early 2000s and mid 2010s than it was, say, in the 80s and whatnot. But I will say that it was a league of stars, and you and I have talked about this before, and I think that's also different than what it is in today's NBA, where we only focus on a few players, or the media only focuses on a few players, and we only have a few true superstars. It felt like, when we were growing up watching basketball in the 90s and then early 2000s, mid 2000s, late 2000s, etc., that the league was full of stars. Right, full of superstars, players that were must watch, interesting personalities, great athletes, and whatnot. And I feel like that's different than it is today.
And to your earlier point, if the comment that he made was, I think today's players are as good as ever, I think they could play in any generation, celebrating this as the next era in a tremendous lineage of professional basketball, that'd be more acceptable. You may disagree that players are more skilled today or whatever, or just as skilled as the case may be, as we've discussed on this show, but it wouldn't be disrespecting the past as he's done. It wouldn't be dismissing the past as he did. So yeah, that would have been a much more palatable statement to my mind. But yeah, as it is, dismissing decades of NBA history is ludicrously disrespectful.
Yeah, and I think there are incredible players in today's NBA. Steph Curry, right? I think Anthony Edwards oftentimes shines. Wemby, as you mentioned. I think Doncic is incredibly skilled. I think Jokic is an incredibly impressive player. All of that. So I can give flowers to today's NBA players. A lot of times I can get impressed by, things that I see on court in today's NBA. I wish that, people like Stan Van Gundy and other people in the media or former coaches and players and stuff would approach this conversation more like that, more like appreciating the present and appreciating the past. T. Gentry at Bucky T states, totally disagree. It's like saying Jordan, Barkley, Drexler, Magic, etc. never existed. Exactly.
Yep.
Mike P for 3 at Mike Purchard states, strongly disagree with that statement. You're cutting out prime MJ, Bird, Magic, Pippen, Dream, and so on. What a stupid statement from a coach old enough to know better. He's clearly just saying this to get his name mentioned in social media. Sometimes I think these people, Mike, are told to say this stuff, or told to say something controversial and all of that stuff. And part of me, and there's no way I can prove this, thinks that it could be part of their contract in some way or shape or form with whatever network they're in or anything like, or something like that. It's just all ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, I made the comparison to gaming influencers earlier, and you've pointed this out on social media before, Derek, that around the launch of a new 2K, there often seems to be that wave of very similar posts pumping up the upcoming game.
And crapping on the past game.
Yep.
That's usually what it is, and it's usually during the preview season. This is going to be way better than 2K25. 2K25 had all of these issues. Oh, they finally fixed this, all blah, blah, blah. That's all the stuff that you get. Neon and Butch Gaming at Stildo33, friend of the show, has been on a couple times, states disagree. Stasho Bro at Nate Stasho states, the rules have changed so much, you can't compare eras. And, going back to what I stated about Bob Cousy, like I said, throw JJ Redick back in the 50s as he is now and see how he handles having to slap the ball and the rules and the shoe tech and all of that stuff. Let's see them throw any players that are currently playing in that era and make them play by those rules and etc. So it's tough to compare eras sometimes because of the rule changes, because of what players had to wear in the past as well, especially when we're talking about, like I said, 50s, 60s basketball, 70s basketball, etc.
I mean, you talk about rule changes and what players would do if the game was like this and like that. Michael Jordan in the freedom of movement era, with fewer rim protectors, with that spacing, what he could do. Who is stopping MJ in 2025?
Give Michael Jordan a gather step. Allow Michael Jordan more freedom to even dribble the ball. Let him put his hand under it and everything. I don't think it's crazy to state that he would average 45 or more because his peak was 37.1. You're telling me he wouldn't get 4 more baskets per game? In today's era, I think he'd be the best athlete in the NBA today and the most skilled. And you can't touch MJ. Give me a break.
And hey, if Austin Reeves can get 18 free throws easily in the modern game, MJ's going to spend some time at the line too.
Moving over to Discord, KidCash202 states, I'm not sure who is paying him to make comments like this, nor which job he is currently auditioning for, but I'm not sure of his motive with some of these comments. Sure, some of the best players in history have played in the last 20 years, but the same can and will be said about any 20-year period in NBA history, so that really isn't saying much. The league is only 75 years old, including the ABA. I would expect better from someone his age, experience, and history. No disrespect. And yeah, exactly. You can talk about guys like Steph Curry and LeBron James and whatnot, stating that, over the last 20 years, they have inserted themselves as some of the greatest players in basketball history. But to chalk it up to throwing away all the years prior to, 20 years ago and stating that none of those players, or implying that those players wouldn't even be able to make the NBA today, what a stupid statement.
And, we talked about how attitudes were different for us growing up, learning about NBA history and being taught that respect. There was a site back in the day, it's always stuck in my mind. It was called Foolish Jordan. It was a Michael Jordan hate site, basically. For all the people that say that MJ was never hated on back in the day, he absolutely was. You just didn't have social media to really amplify those voices. You had to write into a magazine, hope you get published. And of course, some editors didn't like MJ themselves, so they were more apt to publish letters that were bashing the Bulls and MJ back in the day. So it would happen. And of course, you could make sites like this one. I think it was on Justice or Angel Fire or whatever back in the day. But anyway, this Foolish Jordan site, because this is very clever, Derek, misspelling his name as Jordan, the height of wit in the late 90s, early 2000s. But it was making a lot of bad arguments. It was saying, here's Bill Russell. You don't have a clue who Bill Russell is. If you like Michael Jordan, you don't know who Bill Russell is. You don't know who Jerry West was. You don't know the history of the game. And obviously this is an extreme example. It comes from a point of dislike. Although there was a page on that site that made a bit more of a nuanced argument that said, look, I don't really like him. He's not terrible, but I think these players are better. And although it was a poor argument overall, the point is, as I said, back in the day, if you dismiss the past, if you were to say at the time, I think Michael Jordan is the greatest, and Jerry West and Rick Barry and Wilt Chamberlain, Dr. J and Bill Russell, they're all plumbers and dentists, you would lose credibility with that argument back in the day. And again, this Foolish Jordan hate site was not particularly credible, but I will give it credit for talking about the past. And it was actually propping up Bill Russell as the GOAT. So it was making an argument for the past. It was not throwing the past under the bus. I will give it that much. The rest of the site was absolutely stupid and puerile. But yeah, you would lose credibility back in the day if you didn't give props to the history of the game, the rich history of the game, and acknowledge that great players past and present are part of that wonderful history of the NBA.
Yeah, again, I don't remember that ever taking place in my basketball circles. And I also don't remember it happening very often in the media. There was a rare occasion where they would interview a player and he would state, I would do great in this era, all of that stuff. I would do great against this player. I think that happened with Wilt Chamberlain talking about Shaq,
sure,
and matching up with him. But that was rare. It rarely ever happened, right?
And yeah, it is funny how they will dismiss the opinions of players from previous generations or coaches or whatever and say, oh, bitter old head stuck in the past. But when they find somebody from an older generation that agrees with the current narrative, oh, they have credibility. Look at their history in the NBA. You know, talk about cherry picking.
Last response on Discord, Juicy Shaq Meat states, sadly proving once again he definitely has a poor eye for talent, especially after his Pistons GM blunders. And obviously he's talking about Stan Van Gundy there.
And we also had a response on Facebook as well. Tyler says, I would disagree. I would say the best probably played before the last 20 years. And I think a lot of the best players absolutely did.
Completely agree. I think it's the opposite of what Stan Van Gundy is stating. I think that the majority of the best players in the top 75, the best players, played 20 plus years ago. So, yeah, that's it for the responses. But yeah, Andrew, sadly, this won't be the last ridiculous statement we hear from a former coach or player or somebody in the media. This is going to continue to be common. And like you stated, it's going to be interesting when it becomes the norm to basically crap on Kobe's era. When Kobe's era now becomes what they're doing to the 90s now. And crapping on the 90s and prior. And it's hilarious because you go back and watch that footage and you watch players like, you know, Kobe Bryant and Tracy McGrady and Vince Carter. And, you know, you watch those guys and they still look out of this world, right? Amare Stoudemire and everything. And they're going to find some way to state that those players can't play in the current NBA, and it's going to defy logic once again, and it's just going to be a continuing cycle.
As we said, it's already happening. We can see it already on social media, so it will be interesting to see them try to reconcile those conflicting narratives, especially when propping up LeBron in the GOAT debate and so forth. And as my final comment on this, for now at least, as I said in the Discord, Derek, if nothing else, Stan Van Gundy has made Jeff look like the sane one in the family.
Yeah. Actually, I was just watching the Jordan game where Jeff Van Gundy had called him a con man beforehand and kind of challenged MJ. And Jordan absolutely torched the Knicks. So Jeff Van Gundy wasn't very smart there, but he was a good coach. Jeff Van Gundy was a good coach.
I will say that it will take him over the current NBA on ESPN crop of commentators, but thankfully NBA on NBC does seem to be doing a much better job. But as always, thank you to everybody who responded to this week's community question. We love having you as part of the discussion.
Yeah, good stuff. And I am glad to see pushback on stuff like this, right? I am glad to see, that there are people out there that see that it's a hot take, that see that, it doesn't have any backing, that, there's different ways to communicate. And that this is not the way to go. So hopefully, when we see hot takes like this and just stuff that defies logic, that, people continue to push back.
With that being said, that has brought us to the end of this week's show. Thank you for tuning in. And a reminder, you can catch us every week on the NLSC, our YouTube channel, or wherever you listen to podcasts. In the meantime, both we and the NLSC are on social media. So Derek, go ahead and plug the handles.
You can reach me on X, formerly known as Twitter, at D43G and at D4384. I'm also on the NLSC D43 and on YouTube D43.
As for me, I'm Andrew in the forum and Andrew NLSC on X and Blue Sky. The NLSC is on X, Facebook, and Blue Sky at the NLSC. We're also NLSC Basketball on Instagram and Threads. We're on YouTube at NBA Live Series Center. And of course, keep it locked to the NLSC itself, NBA-live.com, for all things basketball gaming. So, thank you again for tuning in, and until next time, I'm Andrew.
And I'm Derek.
Go get buckets, everyone.